Okay, everybody, welcome, bonjour, and welcome to this webinar on meaningful refugee participation, such an important topic to be discussing on World Refugee Day. Indeed, an important topic to be discussing any day. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. This is an initiative that started in 2018 to be able to leverage the capacities of research partners in Canada and with our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East to really advance principles of participation and inclusion in research, policy, and practice as it relates to refugees. It's been a real privilege for LERRN to support this journey on meaningful refugee participation with some of the amazing colleagues and partners that you'll be hearing from today. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live and work is the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I mention that not just out of protocol and respect, but out of a real appreciation for the opportunity to live and work on this land, and out of recognition that these issues of dislocation and dispossession, but also the quest for meaningful participation is an issue that's shared across many communities that strive to have meaningful contributions to policies that affect them, but also that this is an issue that's very much woven into the history of the place where I live. And so as we begin the webinar, I'd invite you to take a moment to reflect on the territory on which you live and work and the journey of reconciliation that may be taking place there. Let me just say how delighted I am to be joining you for this webinar and how grateful I am that I'll be able to play more of a listening role today. Our topic of meaningful refugee participation is, I have to say, one of the most exciting topics in the governance of the global refugee regime. In the aftermath of World War II, we saw this process to develop the norms and the institutions that were meant to govern refugee responses. But it's only within the last 10 years that the core actors of these institutions have recognized something that many of us have known all along, that refugees are not passively waiting for assistance, but that refugees are actively involved in the daily struggle of responding to the challenges that they face and in advancing the pursuit of the protection and solutions. And it was in 2018 with the affirmation of the Global Compact on Refugees that states themselves recognized that responses are more effective when they meaningfully involve those they are intended to protect and assist. This has led to a recognition that there is an emerging norm of meaningful refugee participation. This norm is outlined in an article I had the privilege of co-authoring with Gardi and Alio, who are on the call today. The link to the free access to this article is just coming up in the chat box now. But what we have found is, well, there's a recognition of the value of refugee participation. The question is, how do you go about doing it? And today in the webinar, we have really tremendous perspectives from experts who are not only advancing the principle, but the practice of meaningful refugee participation in diverse ways. And in a moment, I'll introduce to you Dawit Demaz, who is going to be moderating the conversation today. But let me get some of the practicalities out of the way, some words on netiquette and practicalities. First of all, please note that this webinar is in the view-only mode. That means that those of you in the audience will be able to interact by using the Q&A button that you will see at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, there will be time for an open discussion and to respond to questions that you have for the panelists. We'll be curating those Q&A, the input that we receive from you, and Dawit will be facilitating a discussion with the panelists in the second half of the webinar. So please use the Q&A function to be able to pose your questions and share your comments. But when sharing your questions and your comments, we ask you to please be mindful of the language that you use. This is a safe space to share ideas, but hateful or hurtful language will not be tolerated within this webinar and could lead to your removal from the webinar. So please be mindful of the language that you use and be respectful of the opinions of others. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties along the way, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca. That will come up in the chat box there. If you have any technical questions, write to learn@carleton.ca or visit the tech support website for Zoom itself. Please also join the conversation on social media by using the LERRN hashtag, but also the hashtag of the different speakers that we have that you'll see come up on the screen, and the Twitter handle for the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. The link to the recording and a report will appear in the coming weeks on the LERRN website and on the website of the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada. And finally, you will receive a survey at the end of this webinar. Please take some time to complete that survey to let us know if there's any way that we can enhance the webinar experience. But most importantly, I hope you enjoy this webinar. I know that I'm going to learn a lot, as I always do when I'm in conversation with the amazing colleagues who are on the screen. So joining us with some 100 people from around the world who registered for this webinar, who will be joining us over time. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for having me. And now let me pass things over to Dawit Demaz, someone from whom I've learned a great deal and through his work. Dawit is currently the Client Relations Manager at Jumpstart, an amazing refugee-led organization here in Canada that's been leading discussions on complementary pathways and different programming areas here in Canada. Dawit is also a member of the Coordinating Committee of the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada, who has served as a refugee advisor on a Canadian delegation to a meeting of the international refugee system. Dawit brings tremendous practical experience and insight, and also research experience from his graduate work on this topic and his own passion for issues of refugee protection and social justice. Dawit, it's always a pleasure to share a virtual or a physical platform with you, and I'm happy to pass the floor over to you. Dawit, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. You're very kind. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I know a lot of people are joining us from around the world. We're grateful that you are giving us your time in this discussion today. James already introduced me, so I'm not going to repeat that. But one thing I want to say is that I'm grateful that I'm part of RAN Canada and part of Jumpstart Refugee Talent. Both are refugee-led organizations committed to empowering refugees both on the ground and at a policy level. Our colleagues at RAN and LERRN have drafted a definition of refugee-led organization, emphasizing the distinction between refugee-led organizations and other civil society organizations. And a link about that will be shared on the chat, and I encourage you to take a look at it. As advisors of RAN Canada, we acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional and unceded territories of Indigenous nations. We deeply respect the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. As guests on these lands, we are committed to treating them with the highest respect. Today is World Refugee Day, and the theme for this year is Hope Away from Home, a world where refugees are always included. We are commemorating it as the world is grappling with unprecedented displacement, and let us acknowledge the immense suffering endured by refugees worldwide. Forced to flee their homes due to conflict, persecution, and other crises, refugees face tremendous challenges and uncertainties. RAN Canada stands in solidarity with refugees all over the world and strives for a world where refugee rights are upheld, their voices are heard, and their dreams are realized. Briefly about RAN Canada. RAN Canada was established by a group of former refugees with a diverse personal, professional, and geographical backgrounds in late 2020. RAN Canada promotes the inclusion of perspectives, skills, and knowledge of refugees, while also advocating for the protection and rights of all forcibly displaced individuals, including refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless individuals, and others. In today's webinar, we explore the topic of meaningful refugee participation in the governance of the global refugee regime. This panel will shed light on recent developments in this area, particularly the inclusion of refugees in government delegations, their active role in shaping agendas and policies. We'll identify barriers to meaningful refugee participation. We'll discuss strategies to overcome those obstacles and highlight the roles of governments, civil society organizations, and evidence-based research in supporting and promoting refugee participation. Joining me in this discussion are 4 distinguished panelists representing refugee-led organizations. We have Tsering Tonsor from the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada. We have Mustafa Alio from Refugees Seeking Equal Access to the Table, also member of RAN Canada. We have Dr. Huri Tafesh from the United States Refugee Advisory Board. And we have Rabia Talal Al-Mabeid from New Zealand Refugee Advisory Panel. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we dive deep into the discussions, I kindly ask the panelists to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about what meaningful refugee participation means to you. There are questions around what the definition of meaningful refugee participation is, and I would appreciate if you could tell us a little bit about what it means to you. What does meaningful refugee participation means to you? Dr. Hori, I will start with you. Tsering, Rabia, Mustafa will follow after that. As James said, I encourage everybody to put their questions on the chat, and we'll be coming back to those questions. Dr. Hori, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joey, for the introduction. And as you said, as you introduced me, I'm Huri Tafish, and I'm an advisor at SRAB, and I'm a program manager at Refugees International in Washington, D.C. So when we're talking about what meaningful refugee participations means to me, actually, I see meaningful refugee participation, we attain meaningful refugee participation when we reach a point that we don't have to talk about it. Right? When refugee presence on the table is just normal, this is how it should be. When we are at a point where we don't have to explain why and how we should be on the tables that are dealing with issues related to refugee lives. So when we get to a point where refugee presence at the table is as normal as it doesn't raise questions, or as in a point that we don't have really explained why we're here and how we should be here at the first place, this is when I think we have attained meaningful refugee participation.
Thank you, Dalit. Thank you for the great introduction. Thank you, James. Thank you, Dr. Hori. I'd like to start by acknowledging all the attendees, our colleagues, our partners from around the world. I'd like to acknowledge Indigenous people. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm joining here from New Zealand. It's early in the morning, 7 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Thank you for having me. I'd like to start by introducing myself. Rabia Talal Al-Mabeid. I'm from Syria. I'm a former refugee. I live in New Zealand. I'm a New Zealand citizen now. I've been in New Zealand for 6 years. I'm part of the Refugee Advisory Panel in New Zealand. I'm part of the Refugee Advisory Group with UNHCR. I'm also a senior advisor with New Zealand Police, and I work in the engagement space and with the ethnic minority in New Zealand. Meaningful refugee participation requires proactive efforts from government, civil society, researchers, education providers to ensure that the voice of former refugees for matters that affects their lives are heard and listened to, and also they are actively, as Hori mentioned, around the table on all levels, involved in shaping the decision that affects their life directly and indirectly. Yeah, that's how it is. That's how I see it. I'm looking forward to hear from others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zain.
Thank you very much, David. Before I begin, a very happy World Refugee Day to everyone who's joined the webinar. And my name is, as introduced by David, again, my name is Siring Thonsur. I'm a Tibetan, and I was born in India as a stateless refugee because my parents escaped Tibet in 1959 when the communist Chinese regime occupied Tibet. And to me, I am right now joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, which is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am a social worker. I am a settlement manager, manager of the settlement program with Parkdale Intercultural Association, a service provider which works mainly with refugees, newcomers, immigrants, and I tried to, with my lived background experience as a stateless refugee, try to work as hard as possible to create services that could make a difference in the lives of the refugees. And I am also an advisor with Refugee Advisory Network Canada, and also Voice, which is, and again, In Exile, an Agent for Change, which is an advisory group, and it promotes refugees who work in exile. Now, for me, when you talk about meaningful refugee participation, like the theme for 2023, Home Away from Home, a world where refugees are always included, it is so important to include and find solutions for refugees. And this morning, I sent an email to the team in my workplace, and I reminded them about the importance of World Refugee Day and how we should advocate for Refugee Rights Day, refugees' rights. And one of the staff, he sent an email to all of us, and he said, if I may read it very quickly, I call on the world to harness the hope refugees carry in their hearts. Let's match their courage with the opportunities they need every step of the way. And he said that he was a perfect example of where a refugee was hired by this organization. And so that really made my day, and it really encouraged me and the agency to work more for the rights of refugees in Toronto and global as well. And again, to focus on the meaningful participation of refugees. I worked as a refugee and a stateless person way back in the 1995 when the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women was held in Beijing. And the theme of the conference was to advance the status of women globally and provide equality and create opportunity for women. The Tibetan women were denied opportunity to participate in that very important conference, which is talking about advancement of global women's rights.
Yeah.
And so we struggled, and I highly understand how meaningful refugee participation is important, where refugees get access to participate in refugee meetings and conferences, where the rights of refugees are discussed and where decisions are made to protect the rights of the refugees. So this is really important, and I feel all of us should, continue to advocate for meaningful refugee participation. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Zain, for that. Mustafa.
Thank you, Dawit, and feeling privileged sharing stage with fellow advocates. And my name is Mustafa Alio. I'm the co-managing director for our seat, Refugee Seeking Equal Access at the Table. I'm joining from Montreal, Canada, and I also myself acknowledge that I am on a traditional land that belongs to Indigenous people, and definitely grateful for them to welcome me and accept me in this new land. I think when it comes to meaningful participation, and to me, with the few definition, I think there is right now some work going deeper and further, just giving what James mentioned, that this work really has been materializing in the last 10 years. There's a little bit of work right now, even in understanding what's the complete definition of participation, what is meaningful, and in all honesty, I think it continued to be a learning curve for all of us. But I think so far, what I felt from being in various initiatives working on the topic for a few years, to me, I can summarize it in a way where meaningful refugee participation happens when there is the chance of that participation to influence an outcome that being put in process. If the idea to talk about a certain program, about certain services, about where funding would go, and if the participation of refugees, and there is two parts, there's sometimes the part where the participation of refugees is there to inform the decision. And this is one aspect of it. We listen to people, and then based on that, we get together, again, the different stakeholders, and they come up with kind of decision. But then I think the next level, which is where we have the chance not to inform decision, but to influence that decision. And that's where the participation happens. Influencing decisions, that means refugees are part of it from the envision all the way to the implementation, but then all the way also to the monitoring and evaluation of those kind of decisions. I think the second part for participation to be meaningful is that when there is a clear reason why we're doing this. A lot of people, when we go, are we just bringing people to a certain table just for the sake right now? It kind of growing momentum about refugee participation is just kind of to tell people that here you go, we're involving people, or is it that what's the gap that we have in whatever kind of discussion? Would refugee participation address that gap and be able to help us with the gap that we have? And then how would that happen? And based on this, we kind of lead it. So kind of the two aspects for it is that when it has the chance to influence decision, and when there is a clear reasoning and in terms of the how and the why we're asking for the participation in certain setting, that we, implementing those kind of participation.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. All of you raised very important questions, very important points that we will expand in the next few questions that we have. But a good transitioning point that you brought, Mustafa, which is to inform and influence, when participation informs and influence. And so I'd say that there was some willingness from some governments, at least on the informed part, where there is some states are including advisors with lived experience in their delegations. And so the next question is for Dr. Hori and to you, Mustafa, and you can start. How can governments support meaningful inclusion or meaningful participation of refugees beside including advisors with lived experience in their delegations? So how do we expand the informing part, and how do we move to the influencing?
So I think to me, obviously, the first step of including refugees and their delegation, and that's kind of a great step. But again, we always say that this is a small piece of what exactly needs to happen. What is beyond that kind of participation on delegation? How the government are engaging and having conversation with those, with refugees? What are the topics and what are the pain points that government have that they really want the partnership with refugees, they really want the support of refugees in resolving those kind of issues, but then that would lead to better responses ultimately at the end. And I think the government can first is they need to have, and that's kind of what we've seen so far, is that first they need to get into the understanding that it is a learning curve. There isn't something that kind of set and known and kind of a clear pathway on how would that happen. I always, like recently when we're having a chat with some governments on this topic, is like always like you need to get into the understanding as if you're embedding a new organ into a body, which is kind of the government in a way. And then for often when we put like a new organ in our body, it's always there's this kind of a time where both need to adapt to each other, and just kind of there is this kind of a trial and then in terms of getting. So first, the government need to have this kind of understanding that it is a learning curve. There will be a trial and errors. There will be mistakes, but then all of that towards getting to a point that definitely both and mutual or both parties will get a mutual outcome. I think the second one is enabling those participation. There is a one thing to bring someone and then to open the space for them and allowing them and basically be there. And there is a complete different things where we need to enable those kind of participation. Refugees and often refugee experts where, yes, I mean, as you can see from fellows here, that we do work in organizations. We do work, we do have those kind of access on the ground. We're still connected to our communities and other communities in different regions. So we have that kind of a knowledge, but then how can we transition this knowledge to the way where government can understand it? How can we have the capacity, the time, the resources that we can do it? I also, one of the example, government officials, when they go on anything to talk about or participate in certain discussions that would create a policy, they often have, like there is a whole team. It's not kind of a one person that would go there and then start saying things. There's a whole team that will start doing a research and then providing that person and having all those resources and supporting them in order for them to deliver what need to be done in terms of expertise. So this is kind of where the enabling part that could come with connections with academia, that could come with resources and funding for those kind of enablement piece and all of that. And then kind of the last point the government can do is to have the clear intention that really there is kind of a change and really I want this, not because I want to look good, but also the intention and the understanding that can lead to changes in responses. We've seen this in some of the research, but I think there has to be this kind of a commitment and further understanding that truly responses can be better when we engage with refugees. So in a way, that kind of the intention, the enablement part, but at the same time, the understanding that it's going to take a bit of time.
Thank you so much. You raised very important questions. Dr. Houri, would you like to add to Mustafa's points?
Sure, thank you. I think like Mustafa have managed to cover very important points, and I agree with Mustafa. And I think for me, the first one would be the intentions that the government, when including a refugee on the delegation, what is the end goal of it? Is it to check a DEI list that, okay, we had managed to cover, we have a refugee delegate, diversity, equity, and inclusion part, or we really believe that the refugee engagement within our delegation would lead to better results? So when we have the first, we need to have the right mindset. That's why they are on the table in the first place. The intentions really matter. The second, including refugee delegates is really also a very welcoming step and important. But I also see we have to look beyond that when we're talking about the small rooms where real policies and programs are being planned and implemented and evaluated. So I think we should also think about more of mechanisms to include refugee voices or refugee responses within these mechanisms of building policies and programs that are related to refugee lives and refugee issues. So sometimes, yes, delegates and big conferences or events is really important to have refugee representation, but also we have to think beyond that on how we include them on these small rooms, on these policy tables, and to believe that they are capable of being in that room, because we know that, yes, having them on our side, on the government side, having them represent here would lead to better and more efficient policies and programs.
Thank you so much. important points that mentioned here is yes, including refugees to delegates is important, but it should be more. You should create more space for the refugees that are participating in those delegations. There has to be intention. There has to be long-term, intention in developing mechanisms, having a continuous relationship, and so those are all important points. We're going to move to the next question for the interest of time. And this next question is for Rabia and Zarin. What are some of the barriers? So we've mentioned what governments are doing and what they should do and what meaningful refugee participation is. And what are some of the barriers we're witnessing in meaningful refugee participation, and what can be done to overcome those barriers? If you can share any solutions, strategies, examples, anything you can share. Rabia, I will start with you.
Thank you, Dawood. Some of the barriers that I've witnessed, and I think everyone around the world would agree in host countries where former refugees or refugees don't speak the native language, and the language and communication is the biggest one. It's just the effective communication and having those powerful engagement and between refugees and policymakers, or refugees and people who are in charge can be really difficult. And the way to overcome this is to provide translation services and be able to provide learning and education pathways for refugees to be able to get beyond this problem and be able to help overcoming this challenge. Another one could be limited resources or limited funding for refugee-led organization. The lack of capacity. I think, providing large initiative through capacity building initiative and including training programs and mentorship and funding for refugee-led organization would support overcoming this issue. The power dynamics on the ground can be an issue. The people with lived experience and the people who have lived in the country for a long time, ensuring equitable representation, meaningful participation in policy dialogues require some sort of equal or equitable power, and those engagement session has to be in a manner where it's accessible, informed, safe, free, and available for everyone. It need to be substantive and sustained to last for longer than just ticking boxes, as Dr. Hori mentioned, and removing any barriers that could prevent refugees from being involved in upskilling, training refugees to overcome their language and communication barrier. There are many other strategies to limit the challenges, but that's what we have witnessed the most.
Thank you so much. Zarin, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dawood, and thank you, Rabia. I agree with what you said. Definitely, and echoing on what you said, I also would like to add, of course, we all know about it. One of the most important barrier that refugees face is the logistics with travel document. And within our network, Refugee Advisory Network Canada, we've had an advisors who was selected to attend the ATCR meeting at Geneva, along with the government delegation, Government of Canada delegation. However, because of his travel document, refugee travel document, and the visa process, he could not participate in the meeting. And likewise, there are many other refugees with lived experiences who carry a travel document, are not able to attend the meeting because of the logistics issues and are not able to participate in a meeting that talks about meaningful participation and that discusses about refugee rights and policy making and decision making. So this definitely needs to be given high priority at every government level, at every institution level, and see how best of support can be provided to the refugee expert who's attending the meeting, and providing financial support as well to meet the travel expense to attend these meetings. Many refugees live with very small income and probably may not be able to fund or meet the travel expenses. So having financial support to meet the travel expenses to attend the meetings that discuss about refugee rights and decision making and resettlement programs is very, very important. And another thing I would suggest is governments should allocate funding for annual meetings, training, and mentorship to support meaningful refugee participation, which will enhance the government's position on championing the causes of refugees. Host countries and UNHCR should work together to provide travel and logistic support to attend the ATCR, the GCR, which is coming, GCR, and then relevant meetings that discusses refugee resettlement and policy making. Of course, like Rabia mentioned, there are many more challenges that has come our way, but for the lack of time, I'll just end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Language issues, the language of the international meetings, the international relations in itself is a language barrier. Resources, lack of funding to refugee-led organizations, power dynamics. There's a question about that. We'll ask a question about the power dynamics in a little bit, but having lack of having intersectional lens into the question of refugee participation, documentation, and resources to participation are some of the barriers that are mentioned. And thank you all for that. Mustafa or Dr. Hori, in one sentence, if you would like to add any barriers that were not mentioned.
I have a quick one, which is the history of the wrongful engagement of refugees and the international regime, meaning that for a long time or a good number of years now, we have been seeing that refugee engagement was limited to stories, was limited to just bringing a refugee to the table for sake of bringing a refugee to the table. Sometimes they're not prepared, sometimes they don't have the technical expertise, and them pointing out this is what refugee engagement is, which made kind of a stereotype around refugee engagement that refugee representative would be there just for stories or irrelevant emotional talks, and they don't have the technical expertise. So we're dealing with this type of stereotype perceptions toward refugee engagement, which we're trying also to overcome and to, I mean, I don't want to say to prove because we already know what we're doing, right? But like kind of saying like, it is not refugee engagement is limited to storytelling. We have ended here because of years of wrongfully engaging refugees, not in the right way, right? So we're trying to prove that, no, we have experts on this field. We are not on the table because we are just refugees. We are on the table because we have the technical expertise and the professional experience to be here and to inform the conversation.
Yeah, and that goes to the point that was raised earlier, lack of capacity building, lack of long-term intentional planning. So what's happening is last minute bringing refugees to tell their stories and not to share their expertise. Thank you for that addition. We can move to the next question. It was already raised. How do we balance the power dynamics between refugees with lived experiences in hosting countries versus refugees in resettlement countries? I think that it was that good point, right? So many of the barriers that we mentioned now are a barrier. For example, documentation is a barrier for many of us here, but if it's a barrier for us here, how much barrier that is for somebody who's in a country of asylum. And so this is more, inward looking. So, in looking who is a refugee and who is not a refugee, or do you stop becoming a refugee? So I think that's a question around that area. So how do we make sure that this power dynamic is explored, and how do we go around that? So Mustafa and Zarin. Mustafa, you can start.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and obviously it's a very sensitive area where we always talk about where it's obvious refugees in let's say kind of a donor countries or resettlement countries do enjoy a lot more privilege and access to rights, let's say kind of than refugees who are in hosting countries and kind of in waiting time. And in all honesty, that's where most of the work happened, and that's where most of the struggle happened. Anyway, I mean, today we still talk about like kind of, but like now we're getting to over 100 million refugees. We're going to include even the IDPs and people kind of in the global south. And I think it comes from two parts. One is obviously there has to be a clear, we go back to the intention from all stakeholders, including government, that engaging with refugees in hosting countries is very critical because that's where the massive work is there, and even enabling those processes. And we, believe it or not, or at least from my own observation, you see a lot more hunger and need coming from refugees in hosting countries to engage and want it to be part of the responses, because this is even closer affecting their lives issues and literally their life. It's a death and life issues. But then the other side, I think, is on us as a refugees in resettlement countries or kind of a global north, understanding that part of our responsibility is not to forget, and part of our responsibility is that to keep engaged with those people who are on the ground, continue to acknowledge a little bit the little bit more power than we have. Than they do here, and then how can we leverage it, and how can we do it, and to continue kind of understanding and keeping in the back of our mind that our participation is not complete. It's never complete without the participation of those who are in basically are in waiting or global south and all of this. So while we sometimes celebrate some of the achievement that we have, but then also we need to understand that it's always not complete, and it's never going to be complete unless those on the ground have even a higher, let's say, kind of a power of a say than we do in here, and also our advocacy mostly being informed by their needs more than anything else. I mean, still our needs is important and all of that, but then, I never want to neglect or even at one point dare to compare myself in terms of kind of the struggles or the barriers I'm facing with them. We know a lot of refugees that, and even a lot of us, we live in that kind of a guilt sense of why me as a survivor and then not the others. But I think part of it's also to be that bridge. And this is part of now the work we're trying to build within us as a refugees, getting to places within government and all of that, is that there is also the responsibility. We build those mechanisms in the reset, so basically in the hosting countries, and it's our responsibility to stay engaged with those people on the ground more than anything else that we do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mustafa. So yes, being mindful of the power differences and the privilege that we have, making sure that we are engaging continuously and being informed and advocating for spaces, for people on the ground to have spaces as well. Zarin, would you like to add
Sure.
new ideas to that?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with what Mustafa mentioned. And to me, the power dynamics is never complete and will never level until all the refugees are, provided with their dignity and the right to live and return to their own countries. Until then, there will be the power dynamics. Now, when there is the power dynamics, how do we try to balance it? As Mustafa said, and as we all who are working with refugees, for refugees, and advocating for them, it is important that we always continue our struggle and our commitment. There are some people who say, I cannot speak for all refugees. I speak for myself, and I am a former refugee. I beg to differ, and I say I am a stateless person. I am a refugee, and I will always speak for all refugees as long as I can, because there are many refugees in camps, in settlements, and they don't have the access and the privilege to speak as they speak about their rights and their needs. And so we who are with more privilege in a country have the access and the opportunity to advocate for them. And it is very important we continue to advocate and speak as their voice. According to the UNHCR, there are 27.1 million refugees in the world, 53.2 million IDPs, more than 10 million stateless people, and 4.6 million asylum seekers. And it is very sad to know that there are more than 100,000 stateless children in Thailand. It has the biggest population of stateless people in Thailand, and 100,000 stateless children. Imagine the challenge. So it is important that we try to balance the power dynamics by speaking for all of these refugees. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zaring. I think, again, the intersectionality of the nature of the issue is very important. And as you know, statelessness is one of Run Canada's priorities. So absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Dr. Hori or Rabia, if you want to add very quickly, we're running a little behind.
What Mustafa mentioned about us in the resettlement countries having the potential and being able to maximize our potential and making an impact, because in refugees in camps and in waiting situation, they don't have this privilege, and for them it's the norm to advocate. But for us, we might forget with how life takes us in a way. So yeah, I believe our ethical obligation and the way to look at change is to not forget and keep doing what we are doing and steering the flow of engagement on a national, international, and global tables. Thank you.
Absolutely, and for advocating for people on the ground, people in global South to have the platforms and the spaces to participate. And I hope one day Run Canada could organize a webinar inviting refugee-led organizations in the global South only. So thank you all for sharing that. I do see some questions. James is kindly assisting me with compiling the questions. So to the audience, I see your questions. We have one last question, and then we'll get into your questions. So thank you for your patience. So the last question we have, and this is for all of you, and again, we're running a little behind, so I kindly ask you to keep it concise and focused. So the last question we have is, oh, sorry, we have two more questions. Apologies. What role can civil society organizations and evidence-based research play in supporting meaningful refugee participation? And again, earlier we talked a little bit about this distinction between refugee-led organizations and other civil society organizations. And so what can civil society organizations and evidence-based research or academia plays in promoting meaningful refugee participation? Rabia, you can start, and Dr. Hori after that.
Thank you for asking this question, David. It's very important role that they play, and I believe that with evidence-based research play, they do play a role in supporting meaningful participation. Advocating for refugee rights in the host countries and in the resettlement location, providing platforms is a really important one, because refugee advocates some of them are not having the right platforms or the right boards to be able to advocate and speak, where their voices are not just listened to, are actually heard and applied in a decision making space. They can conducting research, gathering evidence, and presenting it to policymakers. Supporting with meeting their basic needs, and then addressing the challenges, being able to having the perspective from lived experience, and improving the design of doing that. Yeah, that's it for me. I'll looking forward to listen to others.
Thank you. Dr. Hori?
Sure. So when we talk about how can civil society organizations support meaningful refugee participation, I was just focusing on three main things. The first one is to also, again, to not include refugee as just advisors on their work. We need to see more refugee in the leadership positions within the civil society organizations. I see some organizations who already deal with refugees. They would go and look for refugees to sit on a committee, to sit on an advisory board, to sit, but like when it comes to real leadership positions in civil society organizations, we're seeing that refugees are facing hard time into getting in the positions of decision making, let's say. So we need to see more of supports for refugees to be in leadership positions, not just in advisory roles and committees and subcommittees and all of that. And also, when the civil society organization is dealing with refugee-led organization, it should be an equal partnership, right? So here, the civil society organization should really look at RLOs as equal partners. We're working together. It's not, we're doing a favor for RLO, or we just like, yeah, like we're having this diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect. So we need to apply for funding. So we should have an RLOs with us, right? So this kind of a meaningful and a truthful engagement where refugees would be in the decision making, where any partnership with RLOs is an equal partnership and not just like RLO is just being there. And when we talk about evidence-based research, I see that academia has a very big role to play here and I see this thing already started by building a new research program around refugee meaningful participation, which I see Mustafa, James, Raz, they already have started to write about that. And it's very new research program where I think we should also focus on measuring the impact of including refugees in the policy tables, and also measuring the impact that RLOs are making despite the challenges they are facing, right? So the academia could focus on looking at how RLOs are doing despite all the challenges they are facing, measuring their impact, and measuring the impact of having refugees in policy in policy tables. But I know because it's very recent, because we're talking about the last 8 years, 10 years of participation, it will take us time to get there where we really have a lot of data that which we rely on to be able to provide a real evidence-based research. But also, I'm always scared of getting to a point where academia also goes on its bubbles again. And they start writing about meaningful refugee participation from sitting in the office at the university, right? Which also will take us in another direction that we hope we don't get there. Hopefully that any research-based or evidence-based research and in such research program would be based on engaging with refugees themselves, not just for sake of doing research and publishing.
Thank you so much. You've given us very concrete ideas on how civil society and academia can engage, and I think those are very, very helpful. Does anyone want to quickly add anything to that? Taryn, very quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. Well, just one point to add about the research topic is that it's very important that civil societies and refugee leaders engage in providing data on the number of refugees, stateless people, and the challenges and the gaps on improving the status of refugees within the countries is very important. And having a data report research would help not only the government, let's say the Canadian government, but also the UNHCR in understanding the exact situation of the numbers that are in regional, global, at the national, international level, so that policies and decision makings and plannings could be implemented. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Taryn. You know, there are very important questions raised. I would want to follow up with some of the points raised, but unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time. So we'll move to the last question. So this last question is for all of you, if you can quickly summarize. We mentioned about the issue of equity and inclusivity, and there's a question of accountability. And so how can meaningful refugee participation contribute in addressing those issues? How meaningful refugee participation can contribute in achieving equity, inclusivity, and accountability within the global refugee regime?
I'm gonna be quick, but like when we talk about equity, inclusivity, or inclusion, I think when people talk about DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, or equity, they mean different things, right? Like when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when it comes to a meaningful refugee participation, I think it addressed the issues of structural and institutional barriers, right? When we have a meaningful refugee participation, we are talking about trying to eliminate the institutional barriers that's keeping refugees from being included in policies and on tables that is directly impacting their lives. We're not talking about inclusivity and equity in terms of some people look at it as celebrating our differences, right? They would talk about including refugees in a way, okay, let's talk about how we are all the same, or let's talk about, share our stories on all these. Some people, like some organization, would look at refugee engagement in this way, that we are promoting equity and promoting inclusivity by bringing the refugees, as I said before, and talk about our stories, and we say like we are all should enjoy our life and we have certain rights. And others would talk about inclusivity and equity in terms of they would think about it in a way that we are all the same, so let's just forget our differences and celebrate our similarities. But when it comes to meaningful refugee participation, I think we are tapping into the third paradigm here, which is looking into the structural and the institutional barriers that are keeping refugees outside. So we're not talking about inclusivity and equity in terms of celebrating our success. We're not talking about equity and inclusion in terms of, oh, let's share our stories. We're talking about inclusivity and equity in terms of really eliminating the barriers that are not letting refugees directly participate in policies, programs, or initiatives that are impacting their lives. And when we're talking about accountability, I think this taps into what we talked about before. When refugee leaders are on, and I would have to highlight this, in a decision-making positions, we will hold people accountable, and we will see more accountability within the civil society field or civil society organization. Because when we're having a refugee or someone from a refugee background on a leadership position or a decision-making position, we will make sure to hold people accountable, because for us, it is not just, as I said before, DEI checklist. For us, it is not just 9 to 5 job. For us, we're there because we know what people are really passing through, because we have been through, or we're still also, like some of us still with refugee documents and refugee statuses. So for us, it's personal. For us, we know the pain of the people. For us, it's all about thousands of more Mustafa, Tsering, Rabia, and Hori who are still abroad, or they still didn't really reach where we reached. So we take this seriously, and we make sure when we are in these positions to really hold people accountable.
Thank you very much. And Rabia, I'll come back to you, but there is a question from the audience that is directly related to what you said, Dr. Hori, and I would appreciate if you could follow up. And the question is, you talked about the difference between participation and storytelling. Is there a distinction between meaningful participation versus meaningful inclusion? Does either term feel more significant? What about the difference between refugee participation within the current structure of refugee system and refugee leadership to challenge or change the structure? Is there a difference between the two?
Just to make sure I get it right, what is the difference between meaningful refugee participation and inclusion?
Yes, so you talked about, yes, refugee participation, storytelling, right? So leading from that, what you said, yes, is there a difference between participation and inclusion?
Yes, for sure. Because we, as I said, sometimes when we're talking about inclusion, for certain people or individuals or organization, inclusion is just having the refugees on the table, then we included them, right? But what is the end goal of including them on the table? Is the end goal of including them on the table is to tell their stories, and then we celebrate that they made it here, we celebrate the success, or we talk about the challenges they are facing. This is inclusion, right? But also there's another part of inclusion that I'm talking about. We're talking about institutional inclusion. We're talking about structural inclusion, and where refugees are being on the table because, as Mustafa said before, to inform and influence and decision making, to inform and influence the planning, evaluating, and implementing of policies, initiatives, and programs. This is when we're talking about more of structural inclusion and equity, right? But when we're just talking about storytelling, sometimes the storytelling are being used in a way that supports our work within the structural inclusion, but sometimes it's being used as something just tell us about your journey or tell us your story. This is not gonna get the refugee anywhere, right? And we're here not to tell our stories. We're here to make sure that others who are still not here get here safely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for clarifying that. And we'll go back to the questions. But Rabia, you were going to add.
Just adding here to the point that it's been mentioned here with stories and sharing stories. And sometimes it's very important to share stories to raise awareness, because sometimes you have racism because of the lack of awareness and not knowing what this person has gone through in their life. I really like as I discussed that with ANZ Refugee Advisory Panel, and this is one of the points that one of my colleagues mentioned, is really liking what UNHCR is doing in Netflix as an example of the films that are being created. So it's so concise, it's so powerful, without getting into the point of victimhood. To mainstreaming media to tell stories, to promote inclusivity. Yeah, I think Dr. Hori covered the most of the question is with accountability and fostering transparency and responsiveness, and having people in powerful positions where they can make decisions and hold others to accountable. That's it for me. That's it regarding this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's a very important transparency, structural and institutional change, and really measuring what's the end goal of participation, not for the sake of including, that goes back to the question, but really measuring the impact. So there is a question from the audience. From what we heard from Canada, New Zealand, and the US, there are clearly examples of refugee participation. What examples or best practices exist where refugees have successfully contributed to decision-making, and how can this be replicated and scaled up?
It can't be like so far identified by a one aspect. Again, like it's a very recent things, but then collectively, I think also I saw a question, one of them, like in terms of successes and inclusion of refugees on delegations too, in a way. And I think one of the ideas is first, definitely this, there's always a consistent conversation with governments on conversations with other, like, so whether bilateral conversation, government to government, or even government to civil society and government to UN agencies, is that, are those conversations being informed better? Are they being driven a little bit differently than what they used to be before? And the answer has always been yes. Having someone who's like an advisor on delegation, on experts on certain topic, or having the connections on the ground, often get the answers of kind of out of the blue questions or scenarios that could happen at ad hoc basis. And always that kind of benefited this kind of a conversation. I think one of the successes is that when a participation on delegation started with one government, and now we start seeing other governments to follow this, this is also a success. The idea that now, and I always kind of give a similar example that led to some statements that we've never, heard before, where, for example, the U.S. government kind of, we've heard it in there, is like at one point they were talking, how can we engage the advisors in our funding mandate to the UNHCR? And here we go, we're talking about, a 40%, this is $2.7 billion. So this is a 40% of the UNHCR budget internationally. Now, for the first time ever, that refugees would have access potentially to those kind of information. We've seen example where the Canadian government start asking some of the advisors on a $200 million funding for refugee programming, and now we're having this kind of an impact. Recently, a few years ago, for the first time ever, we're seeing Canada to say is like, here's a $40 million to be delivered to refugee-led organizations delivering educational program. This is kind of an impact. So but then there is also an impact on the refugee advocacy and leadership. Us being in those kind of places teaches us also something about how government thinks, and also, help in our expectation management and our advocacy and sending the message to people in terms of like how to do and how to expect things a little bit, to go about things a little bit better, and like this kind of understanding. This is also an impact. So I feel like in the last kind of couple of years, I can, mention this is something that we try to follow always with our seat and do a little bit analysis on. But then there are those kind of bits and pieces in different places. But then you look international right now, kind of the language of refugee participation, the funding to refugee-led organizations, kind of a little bit improved. One of the other things we've seen. UNHCR for the first time to create a funding to refugee organization of $50,000. So we see foundations right now getting into this. So there is this aspect, and that definitely led to a different policy. Maybe the last example I want to bring in something I had the privilege to be involved in pretty heavily early on is that, and still unfortunately many people don't even know it, is labor mobility pathways as one of the complementary pathways that a lot of people talk about today. It was almost created by refugees, right? Like we see some, and definitely a great NGOs and INGOs contributing to this, but this was in partnership with refugee-led organization. The idea itself was actually refugee-led as an idea. The first ever platform to register refugee talent was someone who created in Lebanon. And then, advancing this within policies and see how progressive that is within Canada right now, the UK, Australia. Those are example, and nobody has ever before thought of we think of refugees only from a vulnerable perspective. So only under, traditional and humanitarian pathway, but then what about refugee skills? What about refugee aspirations and education? How can we open new doors, and how can we basically, even hosting states, benefit from those refugees? Those kind of the different scenarios and bits and pieces. I think, unfortunately, it's too early for us to, bring them all together and say, here is, the impact, because again, we're talking about only a few years of implementation. James mentioned, it was 10 years in the work, but then only about a year or two of implementation. But then we already start, even in that kind of a short period of time, we start seeing some different things happen in different places. I mean, Refugee Act, I can bring from East Africa, the parliamentary refugee group from Malaysia, for example, in those kind of way, and how progressive they are. There are different places and different initiative and different in different ways and capacities. But I hope academia and research can help us start, putting track on those changes that happen in different parts of the world, which kind of will lead to a better policies in the near future.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for that. And yes, so we've made a good progress. This is an emerging issue. This is still new. We've made a good progress in informing and in some areas even influencing. So I think the examples you gave, the AMPP and how somebody with refugee experience envisioned that, and that is happening, and with the fundings to refugee-led organizations and others. So thank you for that. We'll move to the next question. So the question we have is the Global Refugee Forum is coming in December 2023. What would meaningful refugee participation look like at the GRF? So if quickly you can talk to that. Dr. Fourie, you can start, Tarine and Robbie after.
Sure, I'm just going to be quick. I think a meaningful refugee participation would start from shaping the actual agenda of GRF, right? Not being invited to GRF, at the last minute. I feel like I always say this, refugee participation usually being added as a spices at the end of any recipe, and we don't want this to happen. And I think that there is a big milestone, and they were included in the first GRF, and we have to be open about that. And we really looking forward to more inclusion and more of including refugees in the conversations and preparations leading to GRF, to place what we want to place on the agenda, right? What should be on the GRF. I'm just gonna focus on this for now.
Thank you. That is a significant point. Tarine?
Thank you, David. Yes, GRF is very important, and many UNHCR countries, refugee organizations are working towards it. It's just not. I completely agree with what Hourie said. Inclusion is important, but at the same time, inclusion should be from the very beginning of the GRF, and which means it has been happening at the moment. And I'll just give you an example about the importance of having pledges and commitments by countries, the UNHCR country teams, as well as civil society organizations on different themes, and SDGs, social development goals. So what we as refugees, for example, I am part of the peer review advisory expert group. Mustafa is also here, and what we do is we are provided country pledges. UN country team pledges are provided to us. We review them. We provide our feedback on all of the pledges and commitments that will be submitted at the GRF. And so we are very much engaged and part of it, and we contribute by looking into those and provide meaningful suggestions to make sure that the refugee issues and rights are included in those pledges. And another thing about the GRF is also to make sure that our countries, for example, Canada, and likewise the US and other countries, submit pledges that are relevant to the issues of refugees within Canada and at the international level, so that the refugee issues at the GRF are highlighted and discussed. Likewise, engaging with the World Bank. We did participate last week. RAN Canada participated and engaged with the World Bank to make sure that refugee voices are heard in their engagement with the funding at the global level, and that meaningful participation of refugees and their feedbacks are included in allocating funding and innovative employment programs at different countries, hosting countries. So due to lack of time, I can't talk more, but these are some of the important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsering. And there's a question that's very related to what you said, Tsering. So, it's not only refugee participation on the state side, but the question is, what about refugee participation from other areas, from the UN system, from other human rights, conflict resolution, peace building, development areas. So, for example, some refugees have been tackling human rights, and yet we have a UN human rights system. How can refugees use the tools to identify, understand, and report any type of abuse they might be facing? So I think the question is, why are we limiting refugee participation, or should refugee participation be limited on the state side, or even on our engagement with the states and UNHCR on global refugee issues or refugee summits? Why not expanding that to other human rights, conflict resolution, peace building, and development agencies as well?
I think with this, touching on this one, it goes back to what we talked about, the sustainable process that involves active involvement at all levels, at all tables. So it goes beyond tokenism and requires building partnerships at all levels. So even if it's at UNHCR, states, or refugee organizations, and also acknowledging the disparities among refugee communities and refugee groups and stakeholders, because we understand how different those groups can be. That's it for me here, touching base on this question. I just had a point on the legal side of this thing. I can talk about it.
Please go ahead, Anna.
So in regards to the legal and protection side of things for refugees, I just wanted to mention this point here, where refugees are being protected and protected for the well-being of throughout their journey, and with all the policies that are being made and laws, there should be some elements of social action. So the law can be there, but also the system being responsive to laws that will be for protective and for safety. It's about improving people being able to hold on to their values and being able to live the life that they want. And that combines with my points of raising awareness. So raising awareness, and at the same time making a system where it can respond to racism and lack of awareness and points where refugees are not being included. Not just creating laws and policies, but more creating a responsiveness from the system as a whole. And that goes again on all the levels. It can be within the government or the states or at UNHCR level. Thank you, Dawood.
Yeah, no, thank you. So yes, not only implementing policies and protection guidances, but to implement that, enforce that, and to hold that accountable. Mustafa, anything on the GRF and on engaging on the nexus, and not only on the refugee gatherings, refugee meetings?
I think this GRF is going to be special, especially on this front. There's a lot of work and conversation right now happening on meaningful participation. Interesting enough, we've seen some progress in this. There is the General Advisory Board to the UNHCR that contributing into the development and the planning of the GRF. We know, and also there are refugees themselves who are in the process of identifying refugees coming to the GRF. I think there is the number piece where the last GRF there was only about like 70 something refugees, 72 or 76, I can't remember, out of like 3,500 participants, so less than 2%. I think the number this year definitely will be more. But at the same time, there's the idea is not only about the numbers, like what is the process and how those refugees would influence the conversation in GRF, which is very important conversation. Like that's where a whole society of actors and stakeholders will be there. Definitely has been some progress. It continued to be, there's some planning, there's a planning of engagement from independent refugee organizations and others. Yeah, it's a wait and see time, but absolutely it's a busy time. There's a lot of things that are happening in the background, but all I can see is absolutely complete different than the first, and obviously it was the first. So the 2019 kind of, there was the first GRF, so a lot of things that happened kind of without that much planning, without kind of the experience. The fact that we have a bit of understanding of what happened in the first and how can you do it better, and then there's also the improvement and the progress of refugees in the last 2 years being on delegations, being influencing governments committing to that. So definitely you're going to see something a little bit different for this GRF, and I'll be like everyone else, like on a watch.
Thank you very much. And on the issue of the nexus, does anyone want to add on that?
What do you mean by the issue of the nexus? What was the?
So should our engagement be limited to, with states and UNHCR? Should there be more engagement with human rights and conflict resolution, development, and other actors?
I mean, yes, and that's exactly what's happening a little bit right now. Maybe not kind of very much at a concrete level, or at very a visible level, like with the UN and states. But there is an engagement right now happening with different development actors. There's an engagement, I think, also Horia is part of an organization that engaging with the World Bank on the development issues, where kind of refugees on a human right issue. Definitely, I think with the human right, it just they take it the participation and a human right defenders level. So I don't think now it's very specific to refugees in particular. But I don't know, like I don't want to claim that I have an expertise in this and what would that look like. But when it comes to development actors, this is also something happening. Peace building refugees have been also part of the processes, especially in the African context, where a lot of causes and movement that refugees were part of that peace building after. I mean, is it happening in a perfect way? Again, I'm not the experts to speak on this, but then in a way or another, it is happening. But I think right now, this kind of development would be the most, at least to me, kind of, I'm watching this, and one of the most interesting things where development actors right now are the actors that we should try to engage with, but at the same time, they should try to engage with refugees, because even this kind of the humanitarian development intersectionality is what we're seeing a lot more than before.
Yeah. Saying very quickly, and then we're 3 minutes away from our time, so very
okay.
briefly.
I'll be very quick. Yes, important to not limit ourselves to refugee-led organizations and the UNHCR. It's very important to expand our engagement with the UN human rights mechanisms, at the UN Human Rights Council at Geneva, as well as peace building and human rights organizations. We're also talking about the Global Alliance for Stateless people. So there is a lot of opportunity, and it is important that we expand our engagement with all the possible stakeholders and actors on the platform, and then strive for the end goal, which is advocating for refugee rights and meaningful participation of refugees at various levels. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This has been an exciting conversation, and thank you so much, everybody, for your contribution. I want to give each of you a last sentence on any last message you would like to convey.
this has been a rich discussion. This is not the first, but not the last, definitely. And I just want to say that, all of us as refugee leaders or experts or with lived experiences are working to the best of our capacity. Some of us are working as volunteers. This is a volunteer work for us besides a professional job, right? 9-to-5 job. And it is important that we work to the end goal, but at the same time, work in a collaborative way with the government, with the UNHCR, with other multi-stakeholders, and make it a collaborative effort and not, work in a confrontational way. It is to complement each other. We work to complement the government so that they can bring, more refugees into the country. And it's very important to, upheld this principle and work together in a successful collaborative way. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Hari.
Yes, I want to say that the meaningful refugee participation conversation is still, I see it as a very initial stage of talking about it in terms of actual research program or in terms of discipline. So our approach, I think we're really very new to this and we're learning, as Mustafa said. So I'm just want to ask everyone to be patient with us. We know that our engagement have not been perfect and we might have let a lot of people down who are in the host countries or they want things to move quicker, and we know the urgency and we know this frustration. As Taryn said, we're doing our best and we know this is not enough and we know they are passing through really hard times and they might be looking for a quick relief, quick solution, and sadly we're not there yet.
Thank you so much, Rabia.
Thank you, Dawood. I would acknowledge everyone who's spoken in this discussion. It's been great and very fruitful. Acknowledge all the people who participated and asked questions and viewed the webinar. I think it's work in process, agreeing with everyone what they are saying. We're not there yet, but I think the main thing is to work in a very strategic way, building partnerships along the way based on trust and confidence, and building confidence with the system in what we have. So our refugees and resettlement countries and host countries and everywhere really, very talented people and amazing individuals who are very education oriented and education focused. Building partnerships based on the trust and building confidence, and those people will be important for us to see them in leadership positions where they can hold people accountable, where they can make decisions, and they can it's work in process. We are not there yet, but hopefully with all the efforts, and there is no problems with those courageous conversations, but I think the main theme is to stay on a positive note and to keep this work happening. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mustafa, very briefly, please.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. And really, I think just the one sentence that also want to acknowledge that meaningful participation is not the end goal. And I don't think for me, it was never the end goal. I think the end goal is that to have a better responses, better programming, better understanding of refugee issues. And we understand that without involving the people really kind of deeply and directly affected, those will not get better. So the idea is that that we want things to be better for us and for other refugees. And we think participation is the mean to an end, is not really the end goal. But I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very beautiful, Mustafa, to say it. Meaningful refugee participation is new. It's still early. It's still a work in progress. There's a lot to learn, but it's also not the end goal. And so the end goal is to find lasting solutions to refugees, to hopefully have a global solution to refugees, and hopefully to not have refugees at some point. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm very grateful for all your insights, for all your participation. Special thanks to you, Rabia. I know it's still early in New Zealand, so thank you all so much. I will send it back to James to conclude. Sorry, I know we're 3 minutes behind time. Thank you, everyone.
No, it's just for me to say thank you to you, Dawood, for such a great job in moderating the discussion and moving us through so many topics, and to Huri, to Rabia, to Sering, to Mustafa. I always learn so much from all of you. I'd also like to recognize and appreciate many colleagues who are engaged in this work, joining us. I've seen in the chat box from East Africa, from across Europe. So, particular shout out to friends who are in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya and many places in between. So I just like to say what a privilege it is to be part of this community. Huria, to your point about academics getting out of their ivory tower, absolutely, meaningful refugee participation is as important in the knowledge we produce as it is in mobilizing that knowledge to bring about change. So my thanks to everyone who's on the call today. My thanks to our moderator and our panelists. To everyone watching, please remember that you will receive a survey about this experience. Please keep an eye on the social media handles, on the Twitter handles for LERRNing and for RAN Canada. You'll see notice there when there is a report and a recording of this video available. So wherever you're joining us from, thank you for making time for us on this World Refugee Day, here in the Eastern time zones at least. And wherever you're joining us from, thank you for making the time. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.